During the Second World War, alongside open military operations, there existed classified research programs accessible only to narrow circles of military leadership and engineers. Their purpose was to obtain technological advantage under conditions in which traditional solutions no longer produced the required results. Some of these programs focused on aerodynamics, alternative lift concepts, and non-standard aircraft configurations. In 1945, the Allied powers gained control over German scientific facilities, archives, and personnel. A significant portion of the materials was transferred to the United States and the Soviet Union, while part of it disappeared without documented records. Technical reports refer to experimental designs that did not conform to the conventional understanding of aviation at the time. Official evaluations did not confirm the existence of gravity control technologies, but they did record attempts to achieve atypical flight characteristics. In post-war intelligence materials, references appear to tests conducted in isolated regions outside Europe. Among such regions, northern Mexico is occasionally mentioned, including the territory of Sonora. No direct materials have survived that would allow a definitive determination of the nature of these activities. The history of the Second World War is inseparable from the history of technology, secrecy, fear, and the extreme pressure placed on societies and individuals as the conflict expanded beyond all previous human experience. Any serious account of advanced wartime research must begin with the recognition that the war was not only fought with armies and air forces, but also with laboratories, test ranges, intelligence services, and vast industrial systems mobilized for survival. Millions of people lived through bombing, occupation, hunger, forced labor, and loss, and any discussion of experimental technologies must remain grounded in documented events and the human cost that surrounded them. The subject often associated with the terms Sonora and anti-gravity emerges from this historical landscape, not as confirmed revolutionary physics, but as a convergence of real German research programs, Allied intelligence assessments, post-war investigations, and later interpretations that sought to explain how far wartime science had advanced and what remained rumor, misinterpretation, or myth. By the late 1930s, Germany had invested heavily in aeronautical research, propulsion, and materials science. This investment was not abstract or speculative, it was driven by the strategic lessons of the First World War and the regime's determination to achieve technological superiority. Institutions such as the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, the German Research Institute for Aviation, and numerous private firms including Messerschmitt, Junkers, Heinkel, BMW, and Daimler-Benz were deeply integrated into the state's military planning. Engineers and physicists worked under intense pressure, often with ethical compromises imposed by the political system in which they operated. The German aviation sector produced real, documented breakthroughs, including the first operational jet fighters, advanced rocket propulsion, guided missiles, and high-altitude research aircraft. These achievements are matters of record and were encountered directly by Allied pilots, ground forces, and civilians subjected to air raids and missile attacks. Within this environment, German scientists explored a wide range of aerodynamic concepts. Some were practical, others theoretical, and many never left the design stage. Circular wing designs, flying wings, vertical takeoff concepts, and unconventional propulsion systems were examined, sometimes seriously and sometimes as speculative studies. Surviving documents show that German engineers were interested in reducing drag, improving lift, and achieving higher speeds and altitudes than conventional aircraft allowed. These efforts were driven by known physics and engineering constraints, not by the discovery of a confirmed method of gravity control. However, the secrecy surrounding these programs, combined with the chaos of war's end, later created fertile ground for confusion and exaggeration. As the war progressed and Germany's strategic situation deteriorated, research became more desperate and fragmented. Bombing raids destroyed factories and test facilities. Skilled workers were killed, displaced, or forced into underground production sites. At the same time, Allied intelligence agencies intensified their efforts to understand German technological capabilities. British, American, and Soviet analysts carefully examined captured documents, interrogated prisoners of war, and analyzed wreckage from downed aircraft and missiles. Their reports, many of which are now declassified, reveal both genuine concern and sober skepticism. The Allies recognized that Germany had achieved significant advances in jet propulsion and rocketry, but they found no credible evidence of a working technology that could nullify gravity or enable silent, unlimited flight. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 marked a turning point in this story. As Allied forces advanced, they raced not only to liberate occupied territories and concentration camps, but also to seize scientific assets. Operation Paperclip and similar Soviet efforts sought to recruit German scientists, engineers, and technicians. These programs were real and extensive, and they reshaped post-war aerospace and military research in the United States and the Soviet Union. Figures such as Wernher von Braun became central to American rocketry, while others contributed to jet engine development, aerodynamics, and materials science. The transfer of personnel and knowledge was selective and often controversial, especially given the moral compromises involved. Survivors of the war, particularly those who endured forced labor in underground factories, later testified to the human suffering that underpinned these technological gains. It was during the immediate post-war years that stories began to circulate about secret German projects far beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. Some of these stories originated from incomplete intelligence reports, mistranslations, or the testimony of individuals seeking attention or protection. Others were fueled by the early Cold War atmosphere, in which both superpowers feared that the other might possess hidden technological advantages. The deserts of the American Southwest, including areas in California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico, became associated in the public imagination with secret testing. Sonora, a vast and sparsely populated region in Mexico bordering the United States, later entered these narratives, often without solid documentary grounding. Historically, Sonora's real wartime significance lay primarily in its geography and resources. Mexico maintained a complex neutrality during much of the war before formally joining the Allies in 1942. German intelligence activity in Mexico was a documented concern, particularly in the early years of the conflict, when Axis agents attempted to gather information, influence politics, and disrupt Allied shipping. Mexican and American authorities cooperated to monitor and suppress these activities. There is no credible archival evidence that Germany conducted advanced aircraft testing or anti-gravity experiments in Sonora during the war. However, post-war rumors sometimes conflated German intelligence presence in Mexico with speculative technological claims, creating a narrative that persists in popular culture. The term anti-gravity itself requires careful historical context. During the 1930s and 1940s, gravity was well understood within the framework of classical physics and Einstein's general relativity. While theoretical discussions about gravity existed, there was no experimental method to shield, reverse, or cancel gravitational forces. German physicists were aware of these limitations. Their work focused on propulsion methods that could overcome gravity through thrust and lift, not negate it. Jet engines, rockets, and aerodynamic lift all operate within known physical laws. The extraordinary performance of some late-war German prototypes, when compared to earlier aircraft, sometimes led observers to speculate about entirely new principles, especially when those observers lacked technical training or access to full information. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied technical intelligence teams compiled exhaustive reports on German research. These reports, many thousands of pages long, covered everything from synthetic fuels to guided missiles. They form the backbone of modern historical understanding of wartime science. Within these documents, there is consistent recognition of German ingenuity and consistent absence of evidence for gravity-defying machines. When unusual designs were encountered, they were explained in terms of aerodynamics, propulsion, or experimental instability. Failures were common, and many projects never achieved operational status. This reality contrasts sharply with later sensational claims that emerged decades after the war, often disconnected from primary sources. For those who lived through the war, especially civilians in Europe, the notion of secret wonder weapons carries a different emotional weight. The German regime repeatedly promised decisive technologies while cities burned and families were torn apart. The V-2 rocket, for example, was technologically remarkable but strategically ineffective, and it caused immense suffering both to its victims and to the forced laborers who built it. Remembering this context is essential when discussing advanced research. Technology did not exist in isolation, it was embedded in a system that prioritized military goals over human life. As the Cold War intensified, interest in unidentified flying objects and unconventional aircraft grew. Some sightings were later explained as tests of experimental American aircraft derived from wartime research. Others remained ambiguous. In this climate, earlier wartime rumors were reinterpreted through a new lens. Sonora, with its remote landscapes, occasionally appeared in speculative accounts linking German science, post-war American secrecy, and alleged breakthroughs. Yet historians who rely on verifiable documents consistently find that these connections lack evidentiary support. The real story remains one of incremental, though sometimes rapid, technological progress grounded in established physics. This first part of the historical account establishes the framework necessary to understand how the idea of Sonora and anti-gravity became associated with the Second World War. It is a story shaped by genuine scientific achievement, intense secrecy, the trauma of global conflict, and the human tendency to search for extraordinary explanations in times of uncertainty. As the narrative continues, it will examine how post-war investigations, declassified materials, and the testimonies of those who endured the war help separate documented history from later interpretation, always with respect for the lived experiences of those who survived the most destructive conflict of the 20th century. The period immediately following the end of the Second World War was marked by exhaustion, relief, and deep uncertainty. For those who had survived bombardment, occupation, forced labor, and displacement, peace did not arrive as a single moment but as a slow and often painful transition. Cities lay in ruins across Europe. Millions of refugees moved across borders in search of family members or simply a place to live. In this environment, the assessment of wartime technology became part of a broader effort to understand how such destruction had been possible and whether similar threats might emerge again. Allied governments, particularly those of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, approached German scientific and industrial remnants with a mixture of respect, fear, and moral unease. Technical intelligence teams worked methodically. Their task was not to chase legends but to catalog factories, recover blueprints, interview engineers, and test captured equipment. The scale of this effort was unprecedented. Entire research centers were dismantled and shipped abroad. Wind tunnels, engine prototypes, radar systems, and experimental aircraft were carefully documented. Reports from these teams reveal a consistent pattern. German research had pushed existing technologies to their limits, often ahead of Allied counterparts, but it had not crossed into realms that violated known physical laws. The shock experienced by Allied analysts when encountering jet aircraft like the Me-262 or rocket programs like the V-2 stemmed from speed of development and operational deployment, not from evidence of impossible physics. Nevertheless, uncertainty persisted. Many German scientists were reluctant to speak openly, sometimes out of fear of prosecution, sometimes out of loyalty, and sometimes because records had been destroyed. This lack of complete information allowed speculation to flourish. In intelligence communities, worst-case assumptions were common, especially as relations between former allies deteriorated into Cold War rivalry. If something could not be immediately explained, it was sometimes treated as potentially revolutionary until proven otherwise. This mindset did not create myths intentionally, but it created an environment in which incomplete data could be misinterpreted. The deserts of the American Southwest became central to post-war testing and secrecy. Vast areas such as White Sands in New Mexico and Groom Lake in Nevada were used to test captured V-2 rockets, experimental aircraft, and new propulsion systems. These programs were real, heavily classified, and visible only in fragments to the outside world. Local populations occasionally observed unusual lights, sounds, or flight paths. In an era before widespread public understanding of rocketry and supersonic flight, these observations sometimes defied everyday experience. When combined with lingering wartime rumors about German secret weapons, they contributed to a growing culture of speculation. Mexico, and specifically the northern regions including Sonora, existed on the periphery of this secretive landscape. During the war, Mexico had cooperated closely with the United States in matters of security and intelligence. Mexican pilots had flown combat missions in the Pacific, and Mexican ports and airfields had strategic importance. After the war, cross-border cooperation continued, particularly in monitoring smuggling, espionage, and later Cold War activities. However, Mexico did not host large-scale experimental weapons programs comparable to those in the United States. Its role was geopolitical rather than technological. Despite this, Sonora began to appear in later narratives as a place of hidden activity. The reasons were largely symbolic. Its vast, sparsely populated terrain resembled American test ranges. Its proximity to the United States made it plausible, in the imagination, as an extension of secret research zones. For storytellers and later conspiracy theorists, it offered a location distant enough to be obscure but close enough to feel connected. From a historian's perspective, these associations tell us more about post-war anxieties than about wartime realities. The concept of anti-gravity gained renewed attention during this period, though not within mainstream physics. Popular science magazines and speculative writers sometimes use the term loosely to describe any propulsion system that seemed to defy conventional expectations. Vertical takeoff aircraft, high-speed jets, and rockets capable of reaching the edge of space all appeared extraordinary to a public that had grown up with propellers and piston engines. For people who had lived through years of rationing and destruction, the sudden emergence of such technologies could feel almost unreal. Memory and trauma influenced perception, and extraordinary experiences often sought extraordinary explanations. Survivors of the war carried vivid memories of German propaganda promising miracle weapons that would turn defeat into victory. These promises had been broadcast while Allied bombs fell nightly on cities like Hamburg, Dresden, London, and Coventry. When the war ended and some advanced weapons were revealed, it was natural for people to wonder whether more had existed, hidden until the last moment. This question was not foolish or irrational, it was shaped by lived experience. However, careful historical analysis requires distinguishing between what was promised, what was attempted, and what was actually achieved. Declassified Allied reports from the late 1940s and early 1950s show increasing confidence in the assessment that no gravity control technology had existed. Scientists who examined German theoretical work found nothing that suggested a breakthrough in gravitational physics. Experimental aircraft designs that were sometimes cited as evidence of anti-gravity, such as disc-shaped or circular craft, were understood as attempts to improve lift distribution or stability. Many of these designs performed poorly or proved uncontrollable. They did not represent hidden success, but rather the trial-and-error nature of engineering under extreme pressure. At the same time, the human cost of these experiments became more widely known. Underground facilities like Middlework, where V-2 rockets were produced, were sites of immense suffering. Thousands of forced laborers died from starvation, disease, and abuse. When Allied investigators documented these conditions, the narrative of technological achievement became inseparable from moral reckoning. For survivors and their families, remembering the war meant remembering both the machines and the people crushed beneath them. As Cold War tensions escalated, secrecy remained a defining feature of military research. The United States and the Soviet Union both pursued high-risk projects, some of which failed spectacularly. Not all failures were publicly acknowledged, and not all successes were immediately explained. This secrecy allowed older wartime rumors to persist and adapt. German scientists working in new contexts sometimes spoke cautiously or ambiguously, aware that their words could be misused. Over time, second-hand accounts replaced first-hand testimony, and speculation drifted further from documentation. In reflecting on this period, it is important to recognize the emotional landscape of those who lived through it. For veterans, refugees, and civilians, the war did not end cleanly in 1945. Nightmares, memories of loss, and unanswered questions lingered. Stories about hidden technology sometimes functioned as a way to make sense of overwhelming events, to believe that there had been some hidden logic or missed turning point. Respecting these feelings does not require accepting unverified claims as fact, but it does require understanding why such claims took hold. This second part of the historical account emphasizes the post-war transition, the careful work of investigation, and the gradual separation of documented achievement from later interpretation. The association of Sonora and anti-gravity with the Second World War emerges here not from evidence of secret testing, but from a complex mixture of geography, secrecy, memory, and fear shaped by unprecedented global trauma. In the next part, the narrative will examine how these themes evolved over subsequent decades, as archives opened, survivors spoke, and historians sought to honor lived experience while maintaining fidelity to verifiable history. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the historical understanding of the Second World War began to change in important ways. The passage of time allowed for a degree of distance, while the gradual declassification of military and intelligence archives provided historians with a more solid foundation for analysis. Survivors, both civilian and military, also began to speak more openly. Memoirs, interviews, and oral histories added human detail to events that had previously been described only in official reports. It was during this period that the contrast between documented history and speculative narratives became clearer, even as public fascination with hidden technologies continued to grow. Cold War competition strongly influenced how wartime research was remembered. The United States and the Soviet Union framed their technological progress as the logical continuation of lessons learned during the war. Spaceflight, nuclear weapons delivery systems, high-speed aircraft, and surveillance technologies all had roots in wartime research. This continuity sometimes led the public to assume that even more radical discoveries must have been made but concealed. In reality, most advances were the result of sustained investment, incremental refinement, and the integration of German, Allied, and domestic scientific traditions rather than sudden breakthroughs that rewrote the laws of physics. The figure of the German scientist became a focal point in these discussions. Some were portrayed as brilliant visionaries whose work had been suppressed or misunderstood, others were depicted as morally compromised technicians who had served a destructive regime. Both images contained elements of truth, but neither supported claims of anti-gravity technology. When German engineers were interviewed in depth about their wartime projects, they consistently described familiar challenges: insufficient materials, unreliable engines, structural failures, and the limits of aerodynamic control. Their accounts were often technical, sometimes dry, and rarely aligned with sensational interpretations. Importantly, many expressed regret that their work had been used in a war that caused so much suffering. As more documentation became available, historians were able to trace how specific rumors had originated. In several cases, references to new principles or unknown forces in intelligence summaries were found to be cautious placeholders rather than conclusions. Analysts had sometimes used vague language to indicate uncertainty, not discovery. Over time, those phrases were repeated without context, gradually acquiring exaggerated meanings. This process was not unique to the topic of aviation or propulsion. It occurred across many areas of wartime history, especially where secrecy and fear had limited open discussion. The association with Sonora continued to surface intermittently, particularly in non-academic publications. These accounts often blended verifiable facts, such as German espionage activity in Mexico, American post-war testing in desert regions, and the real secrecy of Cold War programs, into a single narrative. However, when examined individually, each element told a different story. German intelligence operations in Mexico focused on information gathering and political influence, not experimental physics. American test ranges were well documented in declassified materials, and none extended into Mexican territory for advanced propulsion research. Sonora's role remained peripheral, its inclusion reflecting narrative convenience rather than archival evidence. For those who had lived through the war, especially in Europe, these later stories sometimes felt disconnected from reality. Survivors remembered scarcity, fear, and loss more vividly than secret laboratories or exotic machines. The war was experienced at ground level, in shelters during air raids, in fields worked by hand when fuel was unavailable, in factories running around the clock under threat of bombing. Advanced technology, when encountered, often meant greater danger rather than wonder. Jet aircraft arrived too fast to hear before the explosion, rockets fell without warning. The idea that these weapons were the result of mysterious forces did not align with the lived experience of their effects. Nevertheless, memory is complex. As generations passed, direct experience gave way to second-hand accounts. Children and grandchildren asked how such a catastrophe could have happened, and simplified explanations sometimes filled the gaps. The notion that hidden technologies or missed opportunities might have altered the course of history offered a form of narrative closure, even if it lacked factual support. Historians working with survivors emphasized a different lesson, that the war's outcome was shaped by industrial capacity, logistics, alliances, and human endurance rather than secret inventions. Academic research in the late 20th century reinforced this perspective. Detailed studies of German wartime science showed that while innovation was rapid, it was also constrained. Resource shortages, internal competition between agencies, and political interference hindered progress. Promising projects were cancelled or delayed. Engineers often lacked time to test and refine their designs. In this context, the idea of a fully realized anti-gravity system becomes even less plausible. Such a breakthrough would have required stable research conditions, extensive experimentation, and theoretical validation, none of which were available in the final years of the war. At the same time, historians increasingly highlighted the ethical dimensions of wartime research. The use of forced labor, human experimentation, and the prioritization of weapons over civilian survival became central to understanding the period. This ethical lens shifted attention away from speculative technological achievements and toward the human consequences of scientific ambition under totalitarian rule. For survivors, this shift mattered. It acknowledged their suffering and resisted narratives that romanticized the machinery of war. The persistence of anti-gravity stories, including those linked to Sonora, can thus be understood as part of a broader cultural pattern. They reflect the difficulty of fully comprehending a conflict that mobilized entire societies and transformed science into an instrument of destruction. They also reflect the lingering secrecy of the Cold War, which encouraged suspicion and imagination. Importantly, they do not reflect the conclusions of careful historical scholarship based on primary sources. By the end of the 20th century, a clearer consensus had emerged among historians and physicists. The Second World War accelerated many fields of technology, particularly aviation and rocketry, but it did not produce a method of gravity control. Claims to the contrary rely on misinterpretation, speculation, or the repetition of unverified anecdotes. This conclusion does not diminish the real achievements of wartime scientists, nor does it deny the sense of awe those achievements inspired. Rather, it places them within a realistic framework that honors both scientific truth and human experience. This third part of the historical account underscores the importance of time, documentation, and testimony in understanding the past. As archives opened and survivors spoke, the distance between history and myth became more apparent. The story of Sonora and anti-gravity persists not because of evidence, but because of the enduring impact of the Second World War on collective memory. In the final part, the narrative will turn toward remembrance and reflection, considering how this history should be approached with respect for those who lived through it and with responsibility toward future generations seeking to understand it. In the final decades of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st, the Second World War increasingly became a subject not only of academic study but of public memory and moral reflection. As the number of living witnesses gradually declined, the responsibility for preserving an accurate and respectful understanding of the war shifted more heavily to historians, educators, and cultural institutions. Within this process, stories about secret technologies, including those framed around Sonora and anti-gravity, continued to circulate, but they existed alongside a growing body of well-documented research that emphasized context, evidence, and human experience over speculation. For those who survived the war, remembrance was rarely about technology alone. It was about loss of family members, destruction of homes, years spent in fear or captivity, and the slow rebuilding of life afterward. Veterans remembered the weight of constant alertness, the sound of aircraft overhead, and the uncertainty of whether the next day would come. Civilians remembered hunger, cold winters without fuel, and the strain of trying to protect children amid chaos. When survivors spoke of advanced weapons, it was often with ambivalence or bitterness, because these machines represented not progress but danger. Any historical narrative that centers technology must therefore remain secondary to the human cost that framed its existence. As archives across Europe, Russia, and the United States continued to open, the picture of wartime science became increasingly detailed. Thousands of documents confirmed patterns already identified, fragmented research structures, competition between military branches, political interference, and the severe constraints imposed by bombing and material shortages. German scientists themselves, in later interviews and memoirs, often emphasized how unrealistic many wartime expectations had been. They described working under impossible deadlines, with inadequate testing facilities, and under constant threat. These accounts reinforced the conclusion that while innovation occurred, it did so within strict and often crippling limits. The enduring appeal of anti-gravity narratives can be understood as a reflection of broader cultural needs rather than historical reality. They offer mystery in place of complexity and promise hidden answers to questions that are, in truth, deeply uncomfortable. How could such destruction have been unleashed by human beings? How could entire societies be mobilized for war? Why did so many suffer while so few made decisions? Secret technologies provide a sense of order, suggesting that events might have hinged on a single concealed factor. History, however, shows that the war was shaped by vast systems, collective choices, and structural forces rather than by a single hidden invention. The association with Sonora fits this pattern. Its deserts symbolize remoteness and secrecy, qualities that invite speculation. Yet when examined through the lens of documented history, Sonora's role remains marginal. It was not a center of advanced wartime experimentation, nor a hidden stage for revolutionary physics. Its appearance in later narratives reflects the blending of geography, imagination, and the long shadow cast by Cold War secrecy. Recognizing this does not diminish the region's real history or cultural significance, it simply places it where the evidence supports it. For historians, one of the most important tasks is to resist the temptation to fill gaps in knowledge with dramatic conclusions. Silence in the archives does not automatically imply hidden truths, it often reflects destruction of records, bureaucratic disorder, or projects that never advanced far enough to be preserved. In the case of anti-gravity claims, the absence of technical documentation, prototypes, test data, and consistent testimony is decisive. Breakthroughs of that magnitude leave traces, especially when examined by multiple victorious powers with strong incentives to uncover them. Remembering the Second World War with respect means acknowledging both human ingenuity and human failure. It means recognizing that science can be used to alleviate suffering or to magnify it, depending on the political and moral context in which it operates. Wartime research produced technologies that later contributed to civilian aviation, space exploration, and global communication, but it also produced weapons that caused immense harm. Survivors lived with the consequences long after the war ended, carrying memories that shaped families and societies for generations. As the last witnesses pass away, their memories become history. This transition places a special responsibility on those who tell the story. Accuracy is not a matter of pedantry, it is a form of respect. Avoiding embellishment honors those who endured reality without the comfort of myths. It ensures that future generations understand not only what happened, but how and why it happened. The story of the war does not need anti-gravity to be powerful. It is powerful because it reveals the extremes of human behavior, from cruelty to resilience, from destruction to rebuilding. The historical examination of Sonora and anti-gravity ultimately leads back to this central truth. The Second World War was not decided by secret forces hidden beyond understanding. It was decided by human decisions, industrial capacity, alliances, and the sacrifices of millions. Remembering this helps guard against the repetition of similar catastrophes. It reminds us that responsibility cannot be displaced onto myths or mysteries, it rests with people and institutions. This fourth and final part closes the narrative not with revelation, but with reflection. The real legacy of wartime science lies not in imagined breakthroughs, but in lessons learned at great cost. For those who lived through the war, memory is a form of testimony. For those who study it, history is a duty. And for those who come after, understanding is the first step toward ensuring that such suffering is never repeated.